There was one sentence my wife waited 35 years to say. And when she finally said it, I realized there was something about our marriage I had never truly understood. When Maria asked if we could spend our retirement in the Philippines, my first answer was no. Not because I didn't love her, not because I didn't want her to be happy. I honestly believed I was protecting the life we'd spent decades building together. Our children lived nearby. Our grandchildren lived nearby. Our doctors were nearby. Everything we'd worked for was here. So when she quietly looked at me and said, "John," there was one sentence my wife waited 35 years to say. When she finally said it, everything I thought I knew about our marriage changed. Would you spend the rest of yours building one in mine? I didn't answer her, because the truth was, I had never stopped to think about everything she'd given up the day she chose me. Looking back now, I don't think retirement changed our lives. I think it finally taught me how to see my wife. And that story started nearly 4 decades earlier. In 1988, I was serving in the U.S. Air Force, stationed in Okinawa, Japan. One weekend, a friend convinced me to take a short trip to Cebu in the Philippines. I almost didn't go. I had no idea that one plane ticket would shape the rest of my life. Back then, I was 26 years old. The Air Force had stationed me in Okinawa, and like a lot of young service members, I figured I'd see as much of that part of the world as I could while I had the chance. One weekend, a friend talked me into taking a short trip to Cebu. He promised good food, beautiful beaches, and some of the friendliest people I'd ever meet. Honestly, I thought it was just going to be another weekend I'd laugh about years later. Instead, it became the weekend that changed my life. I met Maria on my second day there. She wasn't looking for an American husband, and I wasn't looking for a wife. She was 23, working at a small hotel near the waterfront while helping support her parents and 2 younger sisters. The first thing I noticed wasn't her smile. It was how easily she laughed. Not the kind of laugh people force to be polite, the kind that made everyone around her smile too. We spent nearly the entire afternoon talking, then dinner, then another walk before I had to head back to my hotel. When it was time to say goodbye, I remember thinking, I'm probably never going to see her again. Neither of us knew any better. When I flew back to Okinawa, we started writing letters. A few months later, we were talking on the phone whenever we could. Back then, international calls weren't cheap. Sometimes we'd spend an entire week waiting for one short conversation. But somehow, it was enough. About a year later, I flew back to the Philippines. Not because I wanted another vacation, because I wanted to see her. By the time that trip ended, we both knew where this was headed. When my enlistment was coming to an end, I asked Maria to marry me. She said yes. A few months later, she arrived in America. 2 suitcases, a small photo album, a few gifts from her family, and a life she'd never get back. At the time, I didn't think about that last part. I was too excited. I thought she was gaining something better. It never crossed my mind that saying yes to me also meant saying goodbye to almost everything she'd ever known. The first winter, Maria stood at our living room window for nearly 20 minutes watching the snow fall. She'd never seen snow before. She smiled like a little kid. I remember laughing and asking, "So, What do you think? She looked at me without taking her eyes off the window and said, "It's beautiful." The next morning, I found her outside trying to catch snowflakes with her gloves. She took pictures, made a tiny snowman, even threw a snowball at me when I wasn't looking. I remember thinking, she's going to love it here. And in many ways, she did. The years passed faster than either of us expected. We bought our first house, raised 2 children, spent weekends driving to soccer games, school concerts, and birthday parties. Life became wonderfully ordinary, the kind of ordinary you barely notice while you're living it. Maria learned to love so many things about America. She celebrated Thanksgiving like she'd been born here. She learned to bake cookies every Christmas with the kids. She cheered louder than anyone during football games, even though I'm still not convinced she completely understood the rules. She built friendships. She became an American citizen. She made our house feel like a home. If you had met us 20 years later, you probably would have assumed she'd lived here her entire life. I did. What I didn't see were the little pieces of the Philippines she quietly held on to. Every Sunday morning, before the rest of us woke up, she'd call her family. Sometimes she'd laugh so hard I could hear her from the kitchen. Other times, I'd walk past the bedroom and find her quietly wiping away tears after hanging up. She'd always smile when she saw me. "It's nothing," she'd say. "I just missed them today." I believed her. Then life would move on. Every January, after the excitement of Christmas had faded, I'd notice her standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, looking outside, watching another snowfall. She never complained, never once said she wanted to leave. One morning I asked, "What are you looking at?" She smiled without turning around. "The sunshine," she said. I laughed. "There isn't any sunshine today." She laughed too. "I know." At the time, I thought she was joking. Looking back, I think she was remembering. Before we knew it, our children were grown. The house got quieter, the grandkids started coming over on weekends, and after more than 3 decades of working, retirement finally stopped feeling like something we'd talk about someday. It was right in front of us. One evening, we were sitting on our back porch after dinner. The air had that familiar chill that always seemed to arrive a little too early where we lived. Maria pulled her sweater a little tighter around her shoulders. Then she looked at me and smiled. "Can I ask you something?" I remember smiling back. "Of course." She was quiet for a few seconds, long enough that I knew she was choosing her words carefully. Then she asked, "When you retire, would you ever consider living in the Philippines?" I honestly laughed, not because I was making fun of her, because I thought she was joking. I looked around at our backyard, the maple trees, the fence I'd spent 3 weekends building, the swing set I'd made for our grandchildren. Everything familiar was right there. "Why would we leave?" I asked. "Our kids are here. The grandkids are here. Our doctors are here. Our whole life is here." She didn't argue. She simply nodded. "I know." That was all she said. And somehow, that made me feel even worse. For the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. Not because I was considering moving, because I couldn't understand why she would even ask. I started doing what I always did whenever I didn't understand something. I researched it. Before long, my YouTube homepage looked like every retirement channel on the internet. Americans living in the Philippines, videos about healthcare, cost of living, visa renewals, people sharing what they loved and what they wished they'd known before moving. The more I watched, the more convinced I became that retirement in the Philippines wasn't for us. Healthcare worried me. Being an ocean away from our grandchildren worried me even more. I thought about emergencies, hospitals, long flights, power outages. I even joked with Maria one evening. I've spent my whole life trying to stay warm every winter. You want me to spend the rest of my life sweating? She laughed. I don't want you to sweat. She reached over and squeezed my hand. I just wanted to know if you'd ever think about it. Then she changed the subject. She never brought it up again, at least not with words. Looking back now, I think she realized I wasn't ready to hear the answer she was trying to give me. A few months passed. Life went back to normal. Or at least, I thought it had. Then, little things started catching my attention. Things that had probably been happening for years. I was just finally noticing them. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found Maria making breakfast. She was softly to herself, not in English, in Tagalog. I'd heard those songs for years, but that morning, I stopped and listened. When she noticed me standing there, she smiled. I didn't know you knew all the words, I joked. She laughed. I've been singing these songs since I was a little girl. It sounded so obvious, yet somehow I'd never really thought about it. A few days later, I came home from running errands. She was sitting on the couch with an old photo album open across her lap. Pictures I'd seen dozens of times. Her parents, her sisters, the little house where she grew up, her old school, children playing outside barefoot. She wasn't crying. She was smiling, like someone visiting an old friend. When she saw me, she closed the album and asked how my day had been. That was Maria. She never wanted me to feel guilty for something neither of us could change. As retirement got closer, I started paying attention in ways I never had before. Every Sunday morning, she still called the Philippines. Every birthday, she stayed up late because of the time difference. Every Christmas, she found a way to cook the same dishes her mother had made when she was growing up. She had spent decades building a beautiful life in America, but she had never erased the life she came from. She carried both with her, every single day. Then one afternoon, something happened that changed the way I looked at our entire marriage. We were cleaning out the garage before retirement, sorting through old boxes we'd ignored for years. I opened one marked Maria. Inside were letters, dozens of them, airmail envelopes. Some were from her mother, some from her sisters, some from friends she'd grown up with. Most of them were faded with age. I asked if she wanted to throw them away. She looked at me almost surprised. "Oh, no," she said softly. "I've kept every one." I suddenly wondered what she'd written back. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I found myself thinking about those letters. Before email, before video calls, before smartphones. Those letters had been her connection to home. Sometimes they took weeks to arrive, sometimes longer, and yet she saved every single one. That's when something finally hit me. While I'd been busy building a career, raising our children, and planning for the future, Maria had quietly been carrying two homes inside her heart. She never asked me to choose between them. She simply learned to live with both. And for the first time, I started wondering if retirement wasn't asking us where we wanted to live. Maybe it was asking where we both belonged. About a month later, our daughter invited everyone over for Sunday dinner. The grandkids were running through the backyard. The smell of hamburgers was drifting across the patio. It felt like one of those afternoons you hope never ends. At one point, our daughter smiled and asked, "So, have you two decided what you're going to do once Dad finally retires?" I laughed. "I think we've figured it out." Maria looked over at me. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. We're staying right here. Our family's here. Our friends are here. It just makes sense. I expected Maria to smile. Instead, she simply looked down at her plate. She didn't argue. She didn't disagree. She just quietly nodded. Our daughter changed the subject. The conversation moved on. But something didn't feel right. That evening, after we got home, the house was quiet. I found Maria sitting on the back porch, the same place where she'd first asked me about the Philippines. I sat beside her. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then I asked, "Are you disappointed?" She took a slow breath, not angry, not upset, just honest. "I've never wanted to take anything away from you, John. I love our children. I love our grandchildren. I love the life we've built." She looked out across the yard before continuing. "When I left the Philippines, I knew I was leaving my parents, my sisters, my friends, my language, my home. I never regretted that, not for one day." Then she looked at me. There were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. The same smile I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She reached over and held my hand. Very softly, she said, "I've spent 35 years building a life in your country. Would you spend the rest of yours helping me rebuild one in mine?" I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Because in 35 years, I had never once asked her what she had given up to be with me. That wasn't guilt I felt. It was gratitude, mixed with the painful realization that I had been loved far more generously than I'd ever understood. That conversation stayed with me for days, then weeks. I couldn't stop hearing her words, not because she had tried to convince me, because she hadn't. She'd simply told me the truth. One evening, I walked into the living room carrying my laptop. Maria looked up from her book. I sat down beside her. "I've been thinking," she smiled. "I know. I've noticed." We both laughed. I took a deep breath. "I don't know if I'm ready to move halfway around the world. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't still worried. The health care, the distance from the kids, the flights. What happens if one of us gets sick? I can't pretend those things don't matter." She nodded. "I know they matter." Then I looked at her and said, "But maybe I've been asking the wrong question." She tilted her head. What if we didn't decide today? What if we just went? For a few months. No promises, no house, no big decisions, just us. And we see how it feels." She smiled. Not the kind of smile that fills a room, the kind that's almost impossible to describe. Quiet, relieved, hopeful. She reached across the couch and squeezed my hand. "I'd like that." 3 months later, we were standing inside an airport. This time, we weren't newlyweds beginning a life together. We were two people carrying 35 years of memories, wondering where the next chapter belonged. As the plane lifted into the sky, I looked over at Maria. She was staring out the window, smiling, the same way she'd smiled the first time I met her. For a moment, she didn't look like someone leaving home. She looked like someone finally going back. When we landed in Cebu, the first thing I noticed wasn't the heat. Although, believe me, I noticed the heat. It was Maria. She walked through the airport with a confidence I hadn't seen in years. She wasn't translating signs anymore. She wasn't trying to remember words. She wasn't explaining customs to anyone. She wasn't adapting. For the first time since I'd known her, she was simply home. And I realized something almost immediately. I wasn't learning about the Philippines. I was learning about my wife. The weeks passed faster than I expected. Most mornings, I'd wake before everyone else. I'd make myself a cup of coffee and sit outside while the neighborhood slowly came to life. Instead of snowplows, I heard roosters. Instead of people rushing to work, I watched neighbors stop and talk to one another before starting their day. Kids walked to school laughing together. Someone was always sweeping the front of their yard. Someone else was watering plants. Life didn't feel slower because people had less to do. It felt slower because people made time for each other. One afternoon, Maria's older sister invited the whole family over for lunch. I lost count of how many people showed up. Brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, neighbors who somehow felt like family too. Everyone talked at once. I understood maybe every fifth word. Every few minutes someone would hand me another plate of food anyway. I remember looking across the table at Maria. She wasn't translating conversations anymore. She wasn't trying to help everyone understand each other. She was simply laughing, talking, telling stories, finishing other people's sentences. For the first time, I wasn't watching my wife adapt to my world. I was watching her completely relax into her own. One evening, we walked through the neighborhood where she'd grown up. Children were playing basketball in the street. Someone called out her name from across the road. An elderly woman came out of her house just to give Maria a hug. As we kept walking, I asked her, "Did you know everyone here?" She smiled. "Not everyone." Then she laughed. "But it feels like it." That night, we sat outside long after the sun had gone down. There wasn't much to say. The warm breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear people singing karaoke. I looked over at Maria. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and smiled. Not because she was on vacation, because she was home. That's when I finally understood something that had taken me 35 years to learn. Home isn't always the place where you've lived the longest. Sometimes, it's the place where a part of your heart has been waiting for you. When it was time to fly back to America, I expected Maria to be sad. Instead, she seemed peaceful. On the flight home, she reached over and took my hand. She didn't ask if we were moving anymore. She didn't have to. This time, I was the one who asked. What would it take for us to build a life here? She looked at me with the same expression she had the day I asked her to marry me. She smiled, then quietly said, "We'll figure it out together." A year later, we retired to the Philippines. Not because it was cheaper, not because it was perfect, not because we were running away from America. We came because marriage had always been about taking turns carrying each other's dreams. For 35 years, Maria had built a beautiful life in my country. Retirement gave me the chance to help build one in hers. Sometimes, people ask me if moving to the Philippines was the best decision I ever made. I always tell them the truth. Moving wasn't the best decision. Marrying Maria was. Moving here was simply one more way of keeping the promise I made to her all those years ago. And looking back now, I finally understand there was never just one person who left home when we got married. There were always two of us. I just happened to be the last one to realize it.